Arro! This was recorded on my phone while I was clearing forest for a construction job in eastern Washington. What you're seeing here isn't a bear, and it's not a trick of the light. It's a dogman upright, massive, moving through the trees like it knows exactly where it's going. I didn't even understand what I'd filmed at the time. I only realized later, after I found the den, a place where these things actually live. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I've worked construction and land clearing for 15 years now, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, doing jobs that take me deep into areas most people never see. Remote logging roads, new development sites miles from civilization, utility corridors, cutting through untouched wilderness. I've operated heavy equipment in places so isolated that if something went wrong, help would be hours away at best. I thought I'd seen everything these forests had to offer. Turns out I was wrong about that. The job that changed everything started in late October, just as the weather was turning cold and wet like it does every fall in Washington. A development company had purchased a massive tract of forested land about 40 miles northeast of Spokane, planning to clear it for a new subdivision and industrial park. My crew got hired to do the initial clearing work, taking out trees and brush to make room for the surveyors and engineers who would come later. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, maybe 6 weeks of work if the weather cooperated. There were 5 of us on the crew. I was running the excavator, the biggest piece of equipment we had, perfect for pulling out stumps and pushing over smaller trees. 2 guys were operating chainsaws for the larger timber. 1 guy handled the skid steer for moving debris, and the crew boss coordinated everything and managed the safety protocols. We'd worked together on and off for years, knew each other's rhythms, trusted each other to do the job right. The first week went exactly as planned. We established our base camp near an old logging road, set up our equipment, and started working our way into the forest systematically. The trees were mostly second-growth pine and fir, nothing too massive, with dense underbrush that hadn't been touched in decades. Perfect habitat for deer and elk, which we saw plenty of. Normal wildlife doing normal things. Nothing out of the ordinary at all. Around day 8 or 9, things started feeling off in ways I couldn't quite put into words at first. The wildlife disappeared completely. One day we were seeing deer every few hours, hearing birds constantly, normal forest sounds. The next day, nothing. Complete silence except for our equipment. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no rustling in the underbrush. Just this heavy quiet that pressed down on everything. I mentioned it to the crew boss during lunch break, said something felt wrong about how quiet everything had gotten. He laughed it off, said we'd probably just scared the animals away with all the noise from the chainsaws and excavator. Made sense on the surface, but something about his explanation didn't sit right with me. I'd worked enough jobs in the wilderness to know that animals get used to construction noise pretty quick. They adapt, they come back, they go about their business. This felt different. That afternoon, I was clearing a section of dense undergrowth about 200 yards from where the rest of the crew was working. The excavator's bucket was full of torn-up bushes and small saplings when I noticed something that made me stop the machine and just stare. There were tracks in the soft mud near a seasonal creek, and they were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first glance, they looked canine, like a big dog or maybe a wolf had walked through recently. But the size was all wrong. Each track was massive, easily 10 or 11 inches long and proportionally wide. Way bigger than any wolf print should be. And the stride length between prints was enormous, at least 4 feet, suggesting whatever made them was moving with long, purposeful steps. I climbed down from the excavator to get a closer look, my boots sinking into the same mud that held those prints. The tracks showed 5 distinct toe impressions, which matched canine anatomy. But there was something wrong about the overall shape, something that made my skin prickle with unease. The prints were too elongated, too narrow for the size, and some of them showed what looked like claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads, deep gouges in the mud that suggested serious claws. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, zooming in on the clearest prints. The camera captured every detail, the depth of the impressions, the spacing, the claw marks. I spent maybe 10 minutes examining those tracks, walking along the creek to see where they led. They followed the water for about 30 yards, then turned sharply into thick brush, disappearing into vegetation, so dense I couldn't follow without cutting my way through. I stood there at the edge of that brush line, looking into the shadows, and felt like something was looking back at me. Not a feeling I could explain, just this certainty that eyes were on me from somewhere in that darkness. I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the image of those tracks from my mind. During the drive back to town that evening, I showed the photos to the crew boss. He looked at them for maybe 5 seconds, shrugged, and said they were probably just bear tracks. I wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways those prints were wrong for a bear, but I let it drop. No point starting an argument about something I couldn't prove. Over the next few days, I kept finding more signs that something unusual was in the area. Scratch marks on trees at heights that didn't make sense for any animal I knew. Deep gouges in the bark, 4 or 5 parallel lines like something with massive claws had raked down the trunk. Some of the marks were 8 or 9 feet off the ground, way too high for a bear unless it was standing on its hind legs and reaching up. And these weren't old marks either. The wood underneath was fresh and white, sap still oozing from the deepest cuts. I found scat piles that looked canine, but were far too large, full of deer hair and bone fragments that had been crushed into small pieces. Whatever was leaving these deposits had serious jaw strength to crack bones that way. I found areas where something had bedded down in thick underbrush, creating oval depressions in the vegetation that were easily 6 feet long. The bent and broken plants showed that something heavy had been lying there recently, probably within the last day or two, based on how the stems were still trying to spring back up. The strangest discovery came when I was working near a rocky outcrop on the eastern edge of our clearing zone. There was a small cave entrance tucked under an overhang, maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, big enough for a person to crawl into if they wanted to. The ground in front of the entrance was all torn up, dirt and rocks scattered around like something had been digging or moving in and out regularly. And the smell coming from inside that opening was awful. A thick musky odor mixed with rotting meat that made my eyes water. I stood there staring at that cave entrance for a long time, trying to decide if I should investigate further. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk away, to get back on my excavator and pretend I'd never seen it. But curiosity won out over common sense, like it always seems to. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and got down on my hands and knees to peer inside. The entrance tunnel went back maybe 6 or 7 feet before opening up into what looked like a larger chamber. I could see bones scattered on the cave floor, lots of them, ranging from small animal skeletons to what might have been deer or elk bones. They weren't just lying there randomly, either. They'd been piled up in certain areas, organized somehow, like something was collecting and storing them deliberately. That's when I decided I'd seen enough and backed out of that cave as fast as I could move. I didn't tell anyone else on the crew about the cave. Looking back, I'm not sure why I kept it to myself. Maybe I was worried they'd think I was crazy, seeing things that weren't there. Maybe I didn't want to admit to myself what I was actually seeing. Either way, I kept my mouth shut and went back to work, trying to focus on the job instead of all these strange signs I kept finding. About 2 weeks into the project, I had my first actual sighting of what was making all those tracks and marks. It was late afternoon, probably an hour before we'd normally pack up for the day. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees, making it harder to see clearly. I was operating the excavator in a section of thick forest, using the machine's powerful arm to rip out stumps and clear a path. That's when I saw it through the trees, maybe 80 or 90 yards away. At first, I thought it was a bear standing upright, which isn't that unusual. Bears will rear up on their hind legs to get a better view or to reach something high up. But as I watched, this thing took several steps forward, and I realized it wasn't a bear at all. It was walking upright naturally, purposefully, with a gait that was too smooth and coordinated to be a bear struggling to stay on its back legs. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was hard to judge distance and size accurately through all the trees and shadows. The body was covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the failing light, shaggy and thick like a wolf's winter coat, but the proportions were all wrong. The torso was too long, the shoulders too broad and powerful. The legs were muscular and clearly built for bipedal movement, with a reverse-jointed knee like you'd see on a dog's hind legs, but scaled up massive. But what really made my blood run cold was the head. Even from that distance, even through all the visual obstruction, I could see it was shaped wrong for any animal I'd ever seen. The snout was elongated like a wolf or German shepherd, but the head sat on top of the shoulders in a way that suggested upright posture was normal for this thing. The ears were pointed and alert, swiveling independently to catch sounds from different directions. We made eye contact for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and I'll never forget what I saw in those eyes. Not the blank predator stare of a wolf or bear. This was different. There was intelligence there, awareness, calculation. This thing was looking at me and thinking about me, making decisions about what I represented and whether I was a threat. Then it turned, dropped to all fours with a fluid motion that showed this was equally natural for it, and bounded away into the forest. It moved with incredible speed, covering ground faster than any deer I'd ever seen. I sat there in the excavator's cab with the engine idling, my hands gripping the controls so hard my knuckles were white. My heart was hammering in my chest, adrenaline flooding my system. I'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew about wildlife in these forests. For several minutes I couldn't move, couldn't think, just sat there trying to process what had happened. When I finally got my thoughts organized enough to function, my first instinct was to grab my phone and check if I'd somehow captured video or photos of what I'd seen. I managed to get a short video before it took off. It's shaky and doesn't last long, but it's real. That clip and the way my heart was still pounding afterward are the only proof I have of what just happened. That evening back in town, I spent hours searching online for information about wolf-like creatures that walk upright. That's when I first encountered the term DOGMAN. Read hundreds of reports from people across the country who claimed to have seen the same kind of creature. The descriptions matched what I'd witnessed almost perfectly. 7 to 8 feet tall, muscular build, wolf-like head on an upright body, intelligent eyes, capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal movement. Most of the reports came from Michigan, Wisconsin, and other Midwestern states, but there were scattered sightings from Washington and Oregon too. People described encounters on remote roads, in deep forests, near lakes and rivers. Some reports were obviously hoaxes or misidentifications, but others had a ring of truth to them, a consistency in the details that suggested people were seeing the same kind of creature across different locations and time periods. I went back to the job site the next day with new awareness and new fear. Every shadow between the trees made me jump. Every snapping branch made me spin around looking for the source. I kept my phone ready at all times, camera app open, hoping I might get another glimpse and actually capture evidence this time. But the forest remained quiet, seemingly empty of anything unusual. Just trees and underbrush, and the constant noise of our equipment tearing through it all. Around day 17 of the project, we pushed into a particularly dense section of forest that hadn't been touched by logging or development in probably 50 years or more. The trees were bigger here, older, with undergrowth so thick you could barely see 10 feet in any direction. This was the kind of terrain that would make perfect habitat for any creature that wanted to avoid human contact. Remote, difficult to access, plenty of cover and concealment. I was working the excavator through a section of massive ferns when the bucket hit something solid that wasn't a stump or rock. The impact jarred the whole machine, and I thought maybe I'd hit an old foundation or buried debris from previous logging operations. I backed up the excavator to see what I'd struck, and that's when I realized I'd partially collapsed the entrance to another cave. But this wasn't a small opening like the one I'd found before. This was a major entrance, maybe 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, hidden behind all those ferns and brush. I shut down the excavator and climbed out to investigate. The bucket had knocked away the vegetation and pushed in some rocks that must have been deliberately stacked to partially conceal the entrance. As I got closer, that same awful smell hit me, but stronger this time. Musky animal odor mixed with decay and something else I couldn't identify. It was bad enough to make me gag and step back. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it into the darkness beyond the entrance. The beam illuminated a tunnel that went back at least 20 feet before turning. The walls were natural rock, but the floor looked like it had been deliberately smoothed and cleared of debris. This wasn't just a random cave. This was being used, being maintained, being lived in. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to walk away, to get back in the excavator and pretend I'd never found this place. But I'd come too far, seen too much. I needed to know what was in there. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. So I made probably the stupidest decision of my entire life and decided to go inside with my phone to document whatever was in there. The entrance tunnel was tall enough that I could walk upright if I hunched over slightly. The air inside was cold and damp, that awful smell getting stronger with every step deeper. My phone's flashlight beam bounced off the rock walls, creating weird shadows that made my imagination run wild. After about 20 feet, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, and what I saw there made me stop dead in my tracks. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 15 feet across, with a ceiling that arched up about 10 feet at the highest point. The walls showed signs of being worked somehow, smoothed and shaped beyond what natural erosion would create. But what really caught my attention was what was inside the chamber, all the evidence of intelligent habitation that covered every surface. Bones were piled everywhere, organized into different stacks based on size and type. Small animal bones in one area, medium-sized bones that probably came from deer or coyotes in another, and large bones that might have been from elk or cattle in a third section. Some of the bones had been cracked open, the marrow extracted. Others showed deep gnaw marks from powerful jaws. This wasn't just a feeding area. This was a storage system, a larder where food was being kept and organized. In one corner of the chamber, I found what looked like bedding material. Pine boughs and dried grass had been piled up to create a cushioned area at least 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. The materials weren't randomly thrown together. They'd been carefully arranged in layers, newer, fresher material on top of older, compressed layers underneath. Something had been sleeping here regularly, maintaining this bed over time. The walls had marks all over them, deep scratches gouged into the rock at various heights. Some looked random, but others had patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Parallel lines, circular shapes, groupings that might have meant something to whatever made them. I took dozens of photos, making sure to capture every detail, every angle. This was evidence, real physical evidence that something intelligent lived in these caves. Then I saw something that made my hand start shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind a rock formation, was something that looked like a tool. A heavy stone with one end shaped and sharpened, the other end smooth like a handle. It sat next to several other rocks that showed signs of being deliberately modified. These things were making tools, using them for something. That implied intelligence, planning, abstract thinking. These weren't just animals operating on instinct. I was so focused on examining the tools that I didn't hear the sound behind me at first. When I finally registered it, my whole body went cold. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from the tunnel entrance behind me. Something was standing between me and the only way out, and it had been there for who knows how long, watching me poke through its den. I turned around slowly, bringing my phone's flashlight up, and the beam illuminated something I'll see in nightmares for the rest of my life. A dogman stood in the tunnel entrance, hunched over to fit in the space, its eyes reflecting my light with an eerie green glow. This one was even bigger than the one I'd seen from the excavator, easily 8 feet tall when it straightened up slightly. The fur was dark brown or black, matted and thick. The head was massive, wolf-like, but with that unsettling upright posture. And the teeth, I could see the teeth when it opened its mouth slightly. Huge canines that could tear through flesh and bone without any effort at all. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was trapped in this cave with a creature that could kill me effortlessly, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. My phone light seemed pathetically small against the darkness, offering no protection at all. Then the creature made a sound that I'll never forget. It started as a low growl that I could feel vibrating in my chest, then shifted into something else. Vocalizations that had structure and rhythm, almost like words in a language I'd never heard. It wasn't random animal sounds. This was communication, an attempt to convey something specific. Whether it was a warning or a threat or something else entirely, I had no way to know. The dogman took a step forward into the chamber, and I backed up against the far wall. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It took another step, then another, moving slowly and deliberately, like it wanted to make sure I understood it was in complete control. When it was maybe 6 feet away from me, close enough that I could smell its breath, hot and rank with the odor of old meat, it stopped and just looked at me. I held up my phone, not as a weapon because that would have been ridiculous, but maybe as a gesture of surrender. The dogman's eyes tracked the movement, focusing on the phone with what seemed like curiosity. It tilted its head slightly, studying the device, the light still shining from it. Then it did something completely unexpected. It reached out with one massive clawed hand and gently, almost carefully, pushed the phone down and away from its face. The gesture wasn't aggressive. It was deliberate and controlled, showing fine motor skills that shouldn't be possible for something with paws. Those weren't paws, though. Looking at the hand that had pushed my phone away, I could see fingers. Thick and clawed, yes, but fingers with joints and opposable thumbs. This thing had hands that were somewhere between human and canine, capable of gripping and manipulating objects. After pushing my phone down, the dogman straightened up to its full height, head nearly touching the chamber ceiling. It looked at me for a few more seconds, then turned and walked out of the cave. Just like that. It walked away on its hind legs, moving with that same fluid grace I'd seen before, and disappeared into the tunnel. I stood there frozen against the wall for a full minute after it left, unable to process what had just happened. When I finally got my legs working again, I stumbled toward the tunnel entrance, expecting the creature to be waiting there to attack me when I emerged. But when I reached the entrance and looked out, the forest was empty. No sign of the dogman anywhere. It had simply left, allowing me to go. I ran to the excavator, climbed into the cab, and started the engine with shaking hands. My phone was still recording video the whole time, though the footage from inside the cave was mostly just darkness and my panicked breathing. I drove the excavator back to our base camp area as fast as the machine could go, probably being reckless, but too scared to care about safety protocols. When I got there, the crew boss was waiting, looking annoyed that I'd brought the equipment back early. I told him I was done for the day, that I wasn't feeling well. He could see I was shaking and pale, so he didn't argue too much. I climbed in my truck and drove back to town, checking my rearview mirror the whole way like something might be following me. That night I reviewed all the photos and video I'd captured from inside the den. The images were clear enough to show all the details I'd seen: the organized bones, the bedding area, the marks on the walls, the tools. But the video from when the dogman appeared was too dark and shaky to show much of anything useful. I had amazing documentation of the den, but nothing that clearly showed the creature itself. I didn't go back to work the next day. I called in sick, spent the whole day researching dogman sightings and trying to decide what to do with what I'd found. I knew if I told the crew boss about the den and the encounter, he'd either think I was crazy or he'd shut down the job site to investigate. Neither option seemed good. So I kept quiet and tried to figure out my next move on my own. 2 days later, I went back to the job site, determined to get better video evidence of the den and maybe catch the dogman on camera if it came back. I brought a proper flashlight this time, extra batteries for my phone, and a GoPro camera I borrowed from a friend. I was going to document everything properly, get evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But when I got to the area where the den entrance should have been, I found it completely filled in. Rocks and dirt had been piled into the opening, packed tight and covered with brush and debris. The entrance was gone, sealed up deliberately and made to look natural. I cleared some of the material away with my hands, working for maybe 20 minutes, but the fill went deep. Someone or something had spent considerable time and effort closing off that cave. I stood there looking at the sealed entrance, understanding what had happened. The dogman had come back after I left, realized I'd discovered the den, and sealed it to prevent me from returning or bringing others. It was intelligent enough to understand the threat I represented, smart enough to take action to protect its home. The implications of that intelligence were staggering. For the next 3 weeks, we continued clearing the forest, pushing deeper into the remote areas, and I saw signs of the dogman regularly. Tracks in soft ground, scratch marks on trees, glimpses of something large and dark moving through the shadows just out of clear sight. It was watching us, monitoring our progress, following along as we worked our way through its territory. But it never showed itself directly again, never approached close enough for me to get video or photos. The other crew members noticed things too, though they didn't know what they were seeing. They'd comment on weird sounds at night, strange smells near certain areas, the feeling of being watched. I kept my mouth shut, didn't share what I knew. Part of me felt guilty for not warning them about what was out there. But a bigger part of me knew they wouldn't believe me anyway, and telling them would just cause problems I didn't want to deal with. Around week 5 of the project, we pushed into the last major section of uncleared forest. This area was even more remote than where we'd been working before, accessible only by a rough logging road that probably hadn't been maintained in years. The trees were massive old growth, the kind that had been there for 100 years or more. Clearing them would be a huge job, requiring bigger equipment and more time than we'd originally planned. On the second day working in that area, I found another den. This one was smaller than the first, tucked under the roots of a massive fallen tree. But it showed the same signs of habitation, the same organized bones and bedding material, and tool use. This wasn't just one dogman living in isolation. There were multiple dens, multiple individuals, or maybe even family groups living throughout this forest. The scope of what I was discovering kept getting bigger and more disturbing. I didn't go inside this den. Learned my lesson the first time about poking around in places I wasn't welcome. But I documented it thoroughly from the outside, took photos and measurements, noted the location on my GPS. I was building a case, collecting evidence, even though I still wasn't sure what I was going to do with it all. That night I was lying in my tent at our base camp, unable to sleep because of everything running through my mind when I heard vocalizations in the forest around us. Multiple voices, that same structured communication I'd heard in the cave, coming from different directions. They were talking to each other, coordinating, surrounding our camp. I could track the sounds as they moved, getting closer and then further away, circling in a pattern that felt deliberate. I unzipped my tent quietly and looked out into the darkness. The moon was almost full, providing enough light to see shapes and shadows between the trees. And I saw them out there, at least 3 or 4 dogmen moving through the forest near our camp. They stayed just inside the tree line, never coming fully into the open area where we'd set up our tents and equipment. But they were definitely there, watching us, making sure we knew they were there. The next morning I talked to the crew boss privately, told him we needed to reconsider the project. I didn't mention the dogmen directly, just said I'd seen signs of aggressive wildlife in the area that made me nervous about safety. He listened politely, but made it clear we were on a tight schedule, and the client was expecting us to finish on time. We couldn't just abandon the job because I had a bad feeling. I understood his position, but knew we were making a mistake pushing further into this territory. 3 days later, things escalated in a way that finally forced everyone to take the threat seriously. One of the chainsaw operators was working alone about 100 yards from the rest of us, cutting down a large fir tree. He made the final cut and stepped back to let the tree fall, and that's when he saw it. A dogman standing in the underbrush, maybe 30 feet away, watching him work. He described it later as the most terrifying moment of his life, seeing this massive wolf-headed creature staring at him from the shadows. He dropped his chainsaw and ran back to where the rest of us were working, yelling about a monster in the woods. We all stopped what we were doing and listened to his story. The crew boss tried to calm him down, suggested he'd probably seen a bear, or his mind was playing tricks on him. But the guy was adamant. He knew what he'd seen, and it wasn't any normal animal. He refused to go back to that area, refused to work alone anymore. The fear in his voice and on his face was real, unmistakable. That evening, the crew boss called an emergency meeting. He laid out the situation, the claims of unusual wildlife, the growing sense of unease among the crew, the safety concerns. He made it clear that client expectations and project timelines were important, but they weren't worth getting someone hurt or killed. We'd continue working for a few more days to finish what we could, but if things got any worse, we'd pull out and recommend the client hire a different crew or reconsider the whole development plan. Over those next few days, the activity increased dramatically. We'd find our equipment moved overnight. Nothing damaged, but clearly repositioned by something with incredible strength. Tools would go missing from where we'd left them, then turn up in strange locations far from our work area. One morning, we found massive handprints in the mud all around our base camp, prints that showed those same human-like fingers with claws. Something had walked through our camp during the night, examining everything, touching our stuff, leaving its marks everywhere. The final incident happened on what turned out to be our last day on the job. I was operating the excavator in an area we'd partially cleared the day before, getting ready to pull out the last few stumps so we could call that section complete. The machine's engine was running, bucket loaded with debris, everything normal. Then I saw movement in my peripheral vision and turned to look. A young dogman, smaller than the adults I'd seen, but still easily 6 feet tall, was standing at the edge of the clearing watching me work. It was close, maybe 40 feet away, well within clear view. I could see every detail. The dark fur, lighter around the chest and throat. The pointed ears, alert and focused. The eyes, those same intelligent eyes I'd seen before. The snout, showing hints of teeth when it opened its mouth slightly. We looked at each other for maybe 10 seconds. Then the young one made a sound, a high-pitched vocalization that was clearly a call or signal. Within seconds, 2 adult dogmen emerged from the forest on either side of it, flanking the youngster protectively. Both adults were massive, 8 feet tall or more, muscles rippling under their fur. One of them, probably the dominant one based on its size and posture, took several steps toward me and the excavator. It stopped about 20 feet away and made that same structured vocalization I'd heard before. The message was crystal clear, even without understanding the language. This was a warning. Get out. Leave this area. Stop what you're doing. The tone, the body language, the aggressive posture of the adult dogman made the threat unmistakable. I shut down the excavator immediately, climbed out of the cab, and backed away with my hands visible. The dominant adult watched me the whole time, making sure I was leaving the equipment and moving toward our base camp. When I was about 50 feet away, still backing up slowly, the 3 dogmen turned together and walked into the forest. They moved on their hind legs, upright and coordinated, disappearing between the trees with that same fluid grace I'd seen before. I went straight to the crew boss and told him what happened. I described the encounter in detail, the 3 dogmen, the warning vocalization, the aggressive posture. He could see I was shaking, could hear the fear in my voice. He made the decision right then to shut down the project. We packed up our equipment that afternoon, loaded everything onto the trailers, and drove away from that forest for the last time. The development company wasn't happy about us abandoning the job, but the crew boss explained the safety concerns and recommended they hire a wildlife expert to survey the area before trying to resume clearing work. I don't know if they ever followed through on that recommendation. I don't know if another crew came in to finish what we started. I just know that I wasn't going back into that territory for any amount of money. I still have all the photos and video I captured from inside the den and around the various sites where I found evidence. I've shared them with a few people who research cryptids and unknown species, but I haven't gone public with the material. Part of me wants to share everything, to prove that dogmen are real and living in our forests. But a bigger part of me thinks maybe these creatures deserve to be left alone, to live in peace without human interference. They were here first, long before we started clearing forests and building subdivisions. They've survived by staying hidden, by avoiding contact with humans, by being smart enough to cover their tracks and seal their dens when discovered. The intelligence they showed, the family groups, the communication, the tool use, all of it points to something far more complex than just an undiscovered animal species. These are beings deserving of respect and protection. I think about that young dogman I saw on the last day, flanked by its protective parents. I think about the individual who pushed my phone down instead of attacking me in the cave. I think about the intelligence in their eyes, the structured language, the coordinated behavior. Whatever these creatures are, they're more than just animals. There's something in between, something we don't have a proper category for in our understanding of nature. My advice to anyone working in remote forests, especially in the Pacific Northwest, but really anywhere with large tracts of undeveloped land, is to pay attention to the signs. If wildlife disappears and the forest goes silent, there's a reason. If you find massive canine tracks with those weird elongated proportions, stay alert. If you see scratch marks high on trees or smell that awful musky odor, get out of the area. Don't investigate. Don't try to prove anything. Just leave and don't come back. The reason dogmen have stayed hidden for so long is because they're intelligent enough to avoid us, to understand we're a threat, to take measures to protect themselves in their territory. They've been doing this for hundreds or thousands of years, adapting and surviving while human civilization expanded all around them. They deserve to continue that existence without being hunted or captured or turned into some kind of scientific specimen or tourist attraction. I don't work in forest clearing anymore. Found a job doing commercial construction in urban areas where the biggest wildlife I'll encounter is pigeons and rats. I sleep better at night knowing I'm not pushing into territory that belongs to something we don't understand. Some places aren't meant for human development. Some forests should be left wild and untouched. Those mountains and deep woods, belong to things that were there long before us and will probably be there long after we're gone. If you're thinking about going into the wilderness to search for dogmen, to try to prove they exist or capture evidence, I'm telling you right now, that's a terrible idea. These creatures don't want to be found. They've made that abundantly clear through their actions. They're powerful enough to tear a person apart without any effort, but intelligent enough to show restraint and give warnings instead. Respect those warnings. Leave them alone. Let them keep their secret corners of the wilderness where they can live in peace. The world doesn't need proof that dogmen exist. The people who've encountered them know the truth. That should be enough. These creatures have survived for so long by staying hidden, and maybe that's how it should remain. Some mysteries don't need to be solved. Some things are better left unknown. The forest has secrets it's been keeping for thousands of years, and I'm perfectly fine letting it keep those secrets. I know what I saw in those caves and forests. I know what looked at me with those intelligent eyes. I know what sealed that den to protect its home. And I know that humanity isn't ready for the implications of what these creatures represent. We're still arguing about whether they exist or not, whether all the sightings are hoaxes and misidentifications. We're nowhere near ready to grapple with the reality of an intelligent non-human species living in our forests, using tools, communicating in complex language, raising families, and building communities. So I'll keep my evidence to myself for the most part, share it only with people who are genuinely trying to understand these creatures without exploiting them. I'll tell my story to anyone who asks, but I won't provide exact locations or detailed maps of where the dens were. Those dogmen have suffered enough intrusion from me. They don't need more people coming into their territory with cameras and guns and capture equipment. The weeks following my departure from that job were some of the hardest of my life. I couldn't sleep properly, kept having vivid dreams about being trapped in that cave with those intelligent eyes staring at me in the darkness. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that massive hand reaching out to push my phone down, feel that moment of terror when I thought I was about to die. The psychological impact of the encounter was way worse than I'd expected it to be. I started having panic attacks in confined spaces, which made no sense because I'd never had claustrophobia before. My brain had connected enclosed areas with that cave experience, with being trapped and helpless. I had to leave a movie theater one night because the darkness triggered a full panic attack that left me shaking in the parking lot. I spent hours every night reviewing the photos and video I'd captured, obsessively going over every detail. The organized bones in that chamber, the bedding material, the marks on the walls that might have been communication or record-keeping, the modified stones that were clearly tools. All of it pointed to something far beyond what we consider animal intelligence. These creatures had culture, had passed down knowledge, had social structures and communication systems. I reached out to several cryptozoology researchers, sent them some of the less revealing photos, asked general questions about dogman sightings. Most were helpful, sharing their own research and theories. The serious researchers understood the importance of protecting these creatures and their habitat. One researcher had been investigating dogman sightings for over 20 years, had compiled hundreds of reports from across North America. He told me something that changed how I thought about the whole phenomenon. The encounters that ended badly, where people got hurt, almost always involved humans who were armed and aggressive. The encounters that ended peacefully involved humans who showed submission and respect, who acknowledged they were outmatched and backed down. That matched my own experience perfectly. When I was in that cave, trapped and helpless, I didn't try to fight or threaten the dogmen that found me there. I couldn't have fought even if I'd wanted to, but more importantly, I didn't show aggression. I just stood there, submitted to its presence, accepted that I was completely at its mercy, and it chose to let me go. It could have attacked, could have defended its territory in the most violent way possible, but it showed restraint and intelligence instead. The researcher also told me about patterns in den locations and family group territories. DOGMAN seemed to prefer areas with natural cave systems, rocky outcrops, dense old-growth forest. They avoided places with heavy human activity, but didn't flee entirely when development approached. Instead, they adapted, changed their movement patterns, became more nocturnal and cautious. They'd been living alongside human civilization for hundreds of years, probably thousands, learning our patterns and adjusting their behavior to minimize contact while still maintaining their territories. I started looking at maps of the area where we'd been working, studying the topography and land use patterns. The tract we'd been clearing was sandwiched between protected wilderness areas on 3 sides, with only one edge facing toward developed land. It was a corridor, a connection between larger areas of wild habitat. The dogmen I'd encountered were probably using that forest as a pathway to move between their preferred territories, and our clearing work was threatening to cut off that connection. No wonder they'd been so aggressive in warning us away. About 2 months after leaving the job, I got a call from the crew boss asking if I'd come back. The development company was offering higher pay to resume clearing work. I turned him down immediately. No amount of money could get me to go back into that forest. A few weeks later, I heard the new crew was also experiencing strange incidents. Equipment failures, tools disappearing, crew members reporting feelings of being watched. One guy saw something large and wolf-like watching from the forest edge. The project was moving forward, but progress was slow, hampered by constant unexplained problems. I felt guilty about not warning them more explicitly about what they were facing out there. But what could I have said that wouldn't make me sound crazy? Hey, there are intelligent wolfmen living in that forest, and they don't want you cutting down their trees. They have dens with organized bone piles and tools, and they communicate in a structured language. They'll watch you from the shadows and seal their caves when you find them and give you clear warnings to leave. Yeah, that would have gone over really well. They'd have laughed me out of the conversation. The dreams continued for months, gradually getting less frequent, but never completely stopping. I'd be back in that cave, phone light illuminating organized bones and that massive shape blocking the only exit. Or I'd be operating the excavator and look up to see 3 dogmen standing at the clearing edge, the youngster flanked by protective adults. Sometimes in the dreams they'd attack, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat with my heart racing. Other times they'd just watch me, those intelligent eyes following my every move, and that was somehow even worse than the attack dreams. I started researching indigenous legends from the Pacific Northwest, looking for historical references to creatures that might match what I'd encountered. I found dozens of stories about wolf-like beings that walked upright. Different tribes had different names for them, different beliefs about their nature, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent across cultures and time periods. What struck me most was the respect and fear in these old stories. These weren't just legends to scare children. These were serious accounts of creatures that had to be treated with caution and reverence. The indigenous people who lived in these forests for thousands of years knew about these beings, understood their territories and behaviors, and knew better than to intrude on their space without good reason. Modern society had dismissed all of it as primitive superstition, mythology, folklore, with no basis in reality. We'd cleared forests and built roads and pushed into every corner of the wilderness without regard for what might already be living there. We'd destroyed habitat and disrupted ecosystems and never considered that we might be displacing intelligent beings who had as much right to these lands as we did. The arrogance of it was staggering once you saw it clearly. I tried camping one weekend about 4 months after the encounter, thinking I needed to face my fears. I drove to a popular state park I'd been to dozens of times. I set up my tent in a designated campground surrounded by other campers. But I couldn't do it. As soon as the sun started setting, the panic set in. Every sound made me jump. Every rustling of leaves sent my heart racing. After less than 2 hours, I packed up and drove home, accepting that wilderness camping was probably over for good. The construction worker film's Dogman Den story is mine to tell because I lived it. But the location and specific details that could lead others there, those I'll keep private. Consider this my warning and my plea. If you work in the wilderness and you encounter signs of these creatures, respect their space and get out. Don't be stupid like I was. Don't push into their dens looking for proof. Just acknowledge what you've seen. Accept that the world is stranger than we think, and leave them alone. They've shown remarkable restraint in their dealings with humans, considering how badly we've treated their habitat and how relentlessly we've pushed into every corner of the wilderness. They could have hurt me a dozen times, could have killed me easily when I was trapped in that cave with nowhere to run. But they chose not to. They chose to give warnings, to show measured responses, to allow me to leave. That's a level of intelligence and mercy that demands respect in return. I think about that moment in the cave constantly, replay it trying to understand what was happening from the dogman's perspective. I was an intruder in its home, invading its privacy and security. It would have been justified in attacking me. Any animal would have, but it didn't attack. It watched me, studied me, and deliberately pushed my phone light down in a gesture that seemed almost gentle. It was showing me it could hurt me, but choosing not to. The sealed cave entrance haunts me too. After I left, it took time and effort to fill in that opening, to hide its home from further intrusion. That's not animal behavior. That's reasoning. That's planning. That's a mind that understands not just immediate threats, but potential future dangers. Sometimes I wonder if there's some organization that knows about these creatures, that's been monitoring them for years. It would make sense that someone official would be aware given how many sightings there have been. Maybe there's a reason they've remained officially unacknowledged. Or maybe it's just willful ignorance, our collective refusal to accept something that doesn't fit our understanding of the natural world. Either way, I'm done trying to prove anything. I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. The photos and video I have are evidence enough for me. Whether the rest of the world believes, it doesn't change the reality of their existence. The forest will keep its secrets. The dogmen will remain hidden in the deep wilderness where they've always been. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Not everything needs to be documented and studied and explained. Sometimes the mystery is more important than the answer. Sometimes leaving things alone is the wisest choice we can make. This is one of those times. These creatures have survived this long by staying hidden, by being smarter than us, by understanding that contact with humans brings nothing but danger. I respect that survival strategy. I honor their choice to remain in the shadows. And I'll do my part to protect their secret, even if it means being called crazy by people who've never looked into those intelligent eyes and understood what they were seeing. That's my story. That's what I found in those forests. Make of it what you will.